Дамы и господа, сегодня у нас удивительные друзья музея, потому что они удивительны по форме из-за пандемии нынешней, да, но они также интересны по содержанию. Сегодня у нас два человека, которые будут выступать, которые не имеют никакого отношения к русской миграции и не являются исследователями русской миграции. Они оказались у нас в музее по случаю последней перед пандемией последнего фестиваля. Вот. К нам вначале зашел Джордж, и Джордж представился как человек, который изготавливает аэромодели, и ему просто интересно, поскольку ему интересуют русские модели, он зашел к нам в музей, и я его попросила, чтобы он изготовил модели, которые относятся к периоду гражданской войны. В это время, значит, должна о нем немножечко больше добавить, о Джордже. Джордж Альбертович Зупко. Он профессиональный изготовитель аэромоделей. Кроме этого, он фотограф и писатель. Его работы появлялись в периодических изданиях, таких как Fine Scale Modeler, Flying News and Hobby Trade Journals. Георгий уже пожертвовал модели в такие организации, как Polish Museum в Чикаго и Shamut and Martin Memorial in Gary, штат Индиана. Так что мы очень рады, что я надеюсь, он нам подарит все-таки модель, которую он так долго готовил в течение 1,5 лет нашему музею. Вот. Но самое интересное, что в это же самое время у нас в музее во время последнего фестиваля оказался Георгий Владимирович Григорьев. Оказалось, что это выпускник Московского авиационного института. Мало того, он получил там блестящее образование по 3 специальностям. У него 3 диплома. Сейчас я зачитаю. Последний диплом он получил в 2016 году. Первый диплом – мехатроника, робототехника и интеллектуальные системы. Второй – системы управления, информатика и электроэнергетика. И 3-й диплом – иностранные языки для аэрокосмических специальностей. В настоящее время он является аспирантом совместной программы между организацией Цинхуа, это учебное заведение, да, Юрий? Цинхуа и UC Беркли по специальности микрогидродинамика. Так что я очень рада, что они оказались у нас здесь. Они подготовили большую сопроводительную программу вот, к этому подарку, который мы, наверное, по окончании получим. Так что предоставляю слово Джордж.
Yes. All right. Thank you, Margarita. Well, good morning, everyone. First, I want to thank everyone for coming this morning. Today we're going to be talking about something that has been ignored by the Western media for over 100 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be talking about aviation in Tsarist Russia, roughly from 1900 to 1917. This is the first part of a 2-part presentation. The first part we have entitled Canvas Wings and Iron Personalities, because the early aircraft were basically made of wood and fabric. However, the men who flew them were made of much sturdier stuff. The second presentation, which we are still working on, will be regarding World War I Russian aces during the war. And we will let you know as soon as that is out. So, ever since man looked upon the birds with envy, he always dreamed of a way to be as free. Now, while there were some attempts at ballooning, the problem with balloons is once you go up, you're literally at the mercy of the wind. Now, because there was no commercial interest in it and military uses were very limited, the only people that were really into ballooning were the young, idle rich. And in England, they were referred to as balloonatics. Now, there were several attempts made for steam-powered aircraft, made by the Russian naval officer here, Wojcicki. He developed a steam-powered device in 1884. It was launched from a ramp, was briefly in the air, and then came down. Now, as you can see by the design, it doesn't look very aerodynamic. However, with the right angle to the air, as if this were the design. When it's angled precisely, right angle to the air with a precise amount of thrust, it will stay airborne. Any other conditions, it will fall down.
Did you switch on your camera?
Yes.
Okay, good.
So, while it was mathematically possible for this machine to be airborne, it couldn't stay that way. Now, the science of aeronautics was more actively pursued using gliders. Now, these gliders are similar in concept to today's hang gliders, but radically different in design. And I want to talk about two of the early designers of gliders, because that is what preceded all the aircraft coming afterwards. The first is Octave Chanute, a very prosperous American bridge designer. In the 1890s, he turned his interest to aviation. Chanute designed, then hand-built, and then personally flew his own gliders on the southern shore of Lake Michigan near Gary, Indiana. He chose this location because of the very high sand dunes. Some of them are 100 feet, 200 feet in the air. The reliable, very strong winds off of Lake Michigan. Most importantly, it offered a relatively soft landing field. Now, as a child, I grew up playing in these very same sand dunes without any realization of their historical significance. Today, however, a fine memorial has been erected for Chanute, as well as one of the original Tuskegee Airmen, Lieutenant Robert Martin, located in that very spot. I had the distinct honor of meeting Lieutenant Martin, one of the original Tuskegee Airmen, also known as the Red Tails, at a dedication ceremony at the Aquatorium, in which I presented a model of Lieutenant Martin's P-51 Mustang. Afterwards, he shared some very interesting stories with me and actually showed me his own squadron logbook. Now, as a side note, these same sand dunes were also the site of some very pioneering research in the science of ecology due to the very exotic and diverse plant life found there. So there's my shout out to my home state. Let's get back to airplanes. Now, Chanute was far more than just a designer. He was also a visionary. He wrote a book in 1894, The Progress of Flying Machines. Chanute writes, and I quote, "Let us hope that in the event of a successful flying machine, now only dimly foreseen, will bring nothing but good into the world. It shall abridge distance, making all parts of the globe accessible, bringing men into closer relation. It will advance civilization and hasten the promised era in which there shall be nothing but peace and goodwill among men." Other early aviators believed that the airplane would actually make war obsolete because an aircraft could detect an opposing army mounting on the borders, they could counter it, and thus the war would be senseless. Such were the dreams of many of the early aviators. The other major gliding pioneer was Otto Lilienthal. He conducted numerous flights in Europe and also conducted extensive research and documented all of his flights. After a particularly bad landing accident, which ultimately proved fatal, it was reported that Lilienthal said, "Sacrifices must be made." So while gliders were establishing the essential principles of flight, a critical aspect was missing, and that was power. Now, while the Industrial Revolution, powered by steam, could develop enormous power, they were extremely heavy. And when we are talking about aircraft, weight is everything. Now, in 1903, December 1903, make a note of that date, December 1903, the American inventor Stanley Livingston built a large but underpowered craft called the Aerodrome. He had the full backing of the Smithsonian Institution with over $300,000 in today's money in financial backing. He was also sponsored by the famous inventor of the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell. His design was also launched from a ramp on a ship in the Potomac River in December. The aerodrome left the ramp and went directly into the water. The unfortunate pilot, who was trapped under the wreckage, survived. A local reporter stated that it looked as if a lump of rock had been thrown into the river. Fortunately, the pilot survived. He needed to be revived with some strong drink, and I would imagine Mr. Livingston needed some as well. All in all, this was a very public, very expensive embarrassment to the most prestigious institution in the United States. Yet, only a couple of weeks later, a couple of brothers from Ohio, the Wrights, built the first successfully powered controlled aircraft. They used their own money and even built their own gasoline engine to power it, which goes to prove beyond a doubt what can be accomplished by a man or two and his garage. Now, while the Wrights did fly, they were also very secretive about their invention, as they were afraid of people stealing it. Now, Russia at the time was developing a lot of research into the theories of flight, but there was usually lacking funding to actually build experimental models. France at the time was considered the leading aviation technology expert. However, they never developed a controllable aircraft. Keep in mind that most people at this time believed, well, if God had man to fly, he would have given us wings. So there was a lot of skepticism about the early aviators. Now, after the Wrights flew in France for the first time in 1908, their achievement was finally recognized. This event sparked an aviation craze. Everyone was designing and building their own technological breakthroughs. Some were successful, others not. And these are just some of the ideas that people have come up with. And just give you an idea of the variations that people had. Okay. Now, yeah, that's my favorite. Now, an important point to remember in the design and progress of aviation is that it is strictly paced by the development of engines, otherwise known as power plants. As internal combustion engines were still relatively new technology, so was their reliability. Now, there was one Italian chief engineer and owner of an engine company who had very, very high standards. And if your work did not meet his standards, he not only showed you the door, but gave you a black eye or a broken tooth as a severance package. And you think you have a bad boss. Now, as engines became more powerful, aircraft design evolved. To put it simply, the more powerful the engine, the faster you can go, the higher you can go, and the farther you can go. Engine technology, in turn, depends on the technology of metallurgy, fuels, lubricants, but that's another story. Now, the successful aircraft designers began competing for the considerable prize money awarded at various aviation festivals. Prizes were based on altitude achieved, weight carried, and of course, speed. Some festivals drew as many as 100,000 people. In France, during the Reims Air Show, they actually built a special rail line to go to the airfield. And this festival at Reims was the place to be and be seen. There were celebrities, world leaders, even royalty, the world press, military leaders, and various hacks and hucksters. Now, the festival was climaxed at the end of the week by an air race. The air race was a very closely contested contest between two aviators. One was the famous Frenchman who conquered the English Channel, Louis Berlot. The other was an American upstart named Glenn Curtiss. The race was very close, and Curtiss barely won with a blistering speed of 46 miles an hour, 74 kph. So now the international race was on. Faster, higher, farther. This wonderful era of friendly competition was covered beautifully in an old movie called Those Magnificent Men and Their Flying Machines. It is a fairly historic, light-hearted comedy, but it also does feature some very beautiful, very well-built aircraft. Now, as the aviation craze grew, aviators quickly became celebrities. They were dashing young devils conquering the sky. Now, my attire is an approximation of that look minus the leather goatee. The leather jacket was absolutely essential for comfort and weather. The cap, known as the newsboy's cap at the time, popular since ancient times, they say, was worn backwards as it provided less chance of it falling off, and it also provided a place where the aviator could put his goggles, roughly. All right, so they sat up here, and when needed, they would be brought down. All right. Now, last but not least was the scarf, and this had more functions than just looking good for the ladies. Number one, it kept your throat warm. It also insulated your neck from the constant friction of the leather jacket, constantly turning your head. Now, in Russia, these aviation festivals were held in St. Petersburg, and they actually were visited by the Tsar himself. Some military leaders were there, but overall military leaders were very skeptical of aviation, with the exception of Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, who was very far-sighted, and he built up the Imperial Russian Air Fleet as much as he could before the war. Now, while every country had its leading aviation designers, Russia had one of the most outstanding designers whose influence still resonates in today's aviation world. And his name, of course, is Igor Sikorsky. Now, here I have a model of Sikorsky's first and biggest accomplishment, the Ilya Muromets, which I will be talking about in a minute. But first, let's talk about the man. The genius designer aviator was born in Kiev in 1889. His father was a highly respected professor in psychiatry research. He had become very prosperous and world famous from his various lectures and books. He wrote on subjects as psychiatry, general psychology, anthropology, and education. Note, in the Russian Cultural Center, they have one of his books by his father, the Book of Life, which compiles his most valuable life lessons. So Igor was raised to be very intellectually curious. His father raised his children by his own standards and instilled in them a loyalty of church, throne, and fatherland. Igor grew up to be a very self-reliant individual. His mother, herself a doctor, instilled in her children a love of music, art, and literature. Igor studied at the Naval Academy at St. Petersburg and Polytechnic Institute of Kiev as an aircraft designer. Though he dropped out of both schools, his designs were quickly recognized as being superior, with his S-5 design gaining international recognition. Now, while his single-seat aircraft were successful, Sikorsky had much larger dreams. He began building and designing a large multi-engine aircraft from his winnings from the 1912 competition, which gave him a prize of 30,000 rubles. His first large-scale aircraft was called the Ruski Getas. This aircraft had 4 engines and an enclosed crew compartment, which was unprecedented in its day. This was a very bold design for 1913. Fittingly, the foreign press called it Le Grand, or the big one. Now, in 1913, the Ruski Getas was parked awaiting its official evaluations when a French Lorraine aircraft flew directly overhead, and in a freak accident, the Lorraine's engine fell off and landed on the Ruski Getas' wings, damaging it beyond repair. Now, this might have ended most designers' careers. However, not Igor Sikorsky. He decided to build an even bigger aircraft, the Ilya Muromets. The aircraft was named after the famous Russian hero of ancient times. Ilya Muromets was a bogatyr, a man of great spiritual strength and conviction, combined with superior physical power and wisdom to guide his actions. After retiring from a military career, he served in a monastery. Later, Ilya Muromets became an Orthodox saint in the rank of venerable monk. There are some relics about him in the Kiev Cave Monastery still on display today. So that's why Sikorsky named his aircraft after Ilya Muromets, its size and its strength. Now, the model here that I have, it represents one of the earlier versions of the aircraft. There were only a few built before the war, and they were mainly used for reconnaissance because of their long range. The first successful flight that Sikorsky made in this happened just 1 month before World War I, July 1914, when he flew from St. Petersburg to Kiev and back. Now, this aircraft had very distinguished features. As I said, it has an enclosed cockpit, so the pilot is inside, away from the weather. They had plans also to put heaters in, even a bathroom were planned. It also had a unique hatch from which the flight engineer could exit the aircraft, walk onto the wing while in flight, so that he could work on the engines. Later versions, as the war progressed, were armed with more guns and became bombers. But this is an example of one of the early versions. There were proposals before the war for the Ilya Muromets to actually make a flight to the Arctic. There are also some plans for it to fly to the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition held here in San Francisco. There was also plans for a German Zeppelin to visit San Francisco in 1915. Of course, the war canceled all those plans. Now we have a couple of shots which show the Ilya Muromets construction. And yes, this is Igor Sikorsky, and you can see the nose of the aircraft being built. This next shot gives you an idea of the structural strength of the aircraft itself. Originally, the Ilya Muromets were called flying ships. With a wingspan of over 100 feet, 30 meters, and their ability to carry many passengers, they were, for the time, truly ships of the sky. And bear in mind, this was a mere 10 years after the Wrights flew. Just 10 years. Now, during World War I, the Russians, having to cover multiple fronts, covering thousands of miles, meant that their forces had to be spread thin. Later, they were concentrated during certain offensives, but generally speaking, they didn't have enough aircraft to cover the entire front. Aerial duels with the Ilya Muromets, though infrequent, did occur. In 1915, one was attacked by a German two-seater. The Russian gunner returned to fire. The German entered into a shallow dive. There was a gunner behind the pilot in the German aircraft that was seen shaking the shoulder of the pilot. Now, since none of the Russian crew members actually saw the German plane crash, it remains an unconfirmed victory. On another mission in September 1915, an Ilya Muromets returned with over 200 bullet holes in it, and still flew. Another mission in 1916, a bomber was greatly damaged by ground fire as well as being attacked by enemy fighters. The pilot was wounded from the enemy fighters. The co-pilot assisted the pilot as much as he could and even used his own body to shield the pilot from further fire, and in doing so was wounded himself. The aircraft engines were also hit, so the flight engineer walked out onto the wing, repaired the engine, was out there for 30 minutes, enabling the aircraft to finally make it back to base. And all of the crew members did survive, although all were wounded. They were all awarded the St. George's Cross, 4th class afterwards. So any other aerial encounters proved indecisive. The giant aircraft was a formidable opponent and not easily brought down. The aircraft could fly with difficulty on just 2 engines. And later versions of the bomber version carried up to 8 machine guns, so it was quite heavily defended. Now, of the total of 30 aircraft that saw action, only 1 was shot down in an aerial engagement with German Albatross fighters. The Russian aircraft crashed behind German lines. The Germans gave a proper military burial to the crew and notified the Russian authorities of the crew's fate. This type of military courtesy was rare in the beginning and faded as the war and carnage continued. 3 more aircraft were lost to ground fire or mechanical failure. Now, over 100 missions were flown by various Ilya Muromets. The missions mainly were reconnaissance, providing vital information importantly needed by the Army. The Army needed to know where the Germans were, as well as needing to know exactly where their own forces were. We're talking about thousands of men in the field, and it's not easy to keep track of all of them. Now, bombing missions were undertaken, but for the lack of a working bomb site, the results were largely a matter of luck. However, it did deliver a serious blow to German morale, seeing these giant Russian aircraft flying overhead, and conversely, a big boost to Russian morale. Nevertheless, in November 1916, a Ilya Muromet raid piloted by Josip S. Vasco hit a rail center and with a lucky hit destroyed an ammunition train containing 30,000 artillery shells. So imagine that fireworks. Vasco participated in 80 of the 100 missions flown by the giant bomber, eventually becoming its squadron commander. Now, in the chaos of the 1917 revolution, most of the remaining Ilya Muromets remained serving the Imperial or White Russian forces. A few defected to the Bolsheviks, becoming part of the Red Air Force. More were seized when the Reds captured the factory. One aircraft was subsequently recaptured by Ukrainians and pressed into service into the Ukrainian Air Force. Another was commandeered by a Polish crew and became part of the original Polish Air Force. However, by the end of the Russian Civil War, few aircraft remained, and by 1922, they were no longer flying. Now, the legacy of the Ilya Muromets is not anything due to the production figures involved. This legacy far outshines the actual numbers. It provided a glimpse into the future. However, as the Reds gained more power, Igor Sikorsky, as well as many, many other Russian engineers, had to flee Russia, and many came to the United States, where their talents were further recognized and developed. And so now I'd like to talk about Sikorsky as he came to the United States. Now, when he arrived, he didn't have much money. He did have some industrial support. He was supported by the famous Russian composer Rachmaninoff and a considerable loan from his sister. Here in America, Sikorsky developed the S-29. It was an aerodynamic as well as financial success, and yes, he paid his sister back. Sikorsky then turned his attention to flying boats, which by the 1930s was a very lucrative but highly competitive business. Flying boats had the advantage of landing almost anywhere where there was water, and his F-42 flying boat had brought aviation to South America and Asia as well. These luxury liners of the air reduced travel time from Asia from weeks to mere days. This glamorous era of the flying boats was short-lived, unfortunately, as World War II halted all international passenger traffic. The development of the flying boats did, however, establish far-flung fueling bases throughout the world and also gave manufacturers great experience in building large-scale aircraft, which they used during World War II to develop bombers. Now, Sikorsky, firmly established in the aviation world and financially successful, returned to his childhood passion for vertical flight. This interest was rooted in the story that his mother had read to him from the Jules Verne book, Clipper of the Clouds. He began his helicopter work at a young age, and then in the late 30s and early 40s, developed the VS-300. Powered with a 78 horsepower engine and Sikorsky himself at the controls, he first flew in May of 1940. And at this point, I want to point out that Sikorsky was one of the early designers who not only designed, built, and then flew his aircraft. The Wright brothers, A.V. Rowe, and other early aviators were all of that type. Sikorsky, as well as Howard Hughes, were the last of that group that designed and actually flew their aircraft. As aviation construction became more complicated, and demanding, and flying them became much more dangerous, a special breed of pilot emerged. The modern test pilot, while no less courageous, has a list of data to be collected and tests to be made. Gone are the days when the pilot would jump in and say, "Let's see what this baby can do." Now, Sikorsky, free to pursue his personal goals, went on to build the first generation of functional helicopters. As more powerful engines were developed, larger and larger loads could be carried. As the load increases, so does their usefulness. Today, their uses are too numerous to mention, and it's hard to imagine the world without them. Sikorsky regarded his helicopters as his ultimate rescue vehicle. These helicopters perform this duty every day all over the world. From hikers who overestimate their climbing abilities to every sinking ship, it is estimated that over 1 million people have been saved by helicopters. Sikorsky was also featured on the cover of Time magazine. Despite his achievements and his heavy workload writing books, Sikorsky was still a devoted family man and loving father. He finished his career in 1972 and worked up into the very end. And his name continues with the latest Sikorsky Sea King helicopters used by the U.S. Navy to pick up returning astronauts, including the Apollo 11 astronauts. Now, a fine example of the Sea King helicopter is actually on display over at the USS Hornet Museum across the bay in Alameda. We also have very many other aircraft. If you're into aviation, it's a good place to go. Also, a model of one of Sikorsky's most well-known helicopters is already displayed here at the museum. It's behind the screen here. His work on developing bigger and better helicopters continued his entire life. Now, my main focus on aviation today was on fixed-winged aircraft, of which helicopters are not. Helicopters are classified technically as rotary-winged aircraft. Actually, some people say, including some helicopter pilots, that helicopters actually don't fly. Rather, they beat the air into submission. Joking aside, the helicopter has proven to be a rescue vehicle of unparalleled versatility. Of all his engineering achievements, Sikorsky believed that the helicopter was his most significant. He once said, and I quote, "If a man is in need of rescue, an airplane can come and throw flowers on him, and that's about all. But a helicopter can come in and save his life." Sikorsky Aircraft, which is now part of Lockheed Martin, produces the U.S. Navy's most powerful helicopter, the CH-53 King Stallion. What a cool name for an aircraft. And it can carry up to 18 tons. The current heavy lifting record helicopter does belong to Russia, however, and it is the Mi-26, which can carry 22 tons. Unfortunately, it lacks a cool name. Now, Russia's tradition of large aircraft continues to this day. The world's largest cargo aircraft is currently the Antonov 225. Only one was made as it was a specially designed aircraft to carry the never-completed Russian space shuttle Buran. It is used as a transport vehicle to carry exceptional loads throughout the world today. Sikorsky's contributions to aviation are legendary and are too numerous to mention. Yet he was more than just a world-famous aircraft designer. He also wrote extensively on literature, religion, history, philosophy, and anthropology. And his theological essays are currently experiencing a revival in Russia. So from his childhood to his early dreams of helicopters to designing some of the world's greatest helicopters, Sikorsky's influence is still evident today, 100 years later. Also, his name lives on in two of the latest Russian bombers, the Ilya Muromets and the other one, Igor Sikorsky. So this concludes the first part of our presentation. I would like to thank everyone for coming this morning. I want to especially recognize Margarita, without whose assistance this never would have happened in the first place. Also the rest of the Russian staff here at the hospital, at the museum. I used to work at a hospital, so excuse me. Have been extremely helpful, and I want to thank everyone for your time and attention. So, as we conclude, we're going to roll the credits, and Yuri and I would like to present a little tune to kind of wrap things up.
Thinking of the great things we would do, those were the days, my friend, we thought they'd never end. We'd sing and dance forever and a day. We'd live the life we choose, we'd fight and never lose. Those were the days, oh yes, those were the days.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate all your time and attention. We will be making a second presentation, as I told you about the World War I aces. And I want you to pay attention to that one because we also include a real-life princess in this story. So ladies, don't miss out on that one. Again, I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you so much. And of course, my wingman here. Again, without him, it couldn't happen. He filled me in on all of the little details of Russian culture and language that I had no idea about. And as I said, without him, this wouldn't have been as good as it is.
But it's confusing. What is your last name?
My last name is Zupko.
So how are you not related to the Russian?
Well, my grandmother's side was Polish. My grandfather's side, as best as I could determine, was Ukrainian. So kind of close.
I think Austro-Hungarian, yes?
It's a Russian.
Well, my grandfather emigrated from what was then Slovakia, but he, I believe, was part of an earlier migration to Slovakia from Ukraine, the best I can determine. But I can't confirm that 100%. But all my Ukrainian friends at the hospital, when they found out my last name, they said, "Oh, you are Ukrainian." So I kind of stuck with that.
Миша, Михаил.
Any other questions or comments?
Вопрос хотел задать.
Yes.
The engines for Ilya Muromets.
Yes.
Of what? Who is it? The manufacturer. Where it's?
Oh, they had various manufacturers, and they changed various times. Basically, no Ilya Muromets was exactly the same. They had field modifications, but to get back to your question, these were Argus engines. They also used some local manufactured engines, which weren't quite as reliable. And they would also, as I said, change them in the field when necessary. But primarily they were Argus engines, I believe 140 horsepower.
Argus. What does it mean?
Argus was the name of the company. A-R-G-U-S.
Oh, what country?
They were English, I believe.
English.
Yes, yes. In the early days, Russia had to depend on a lot of foreign imports because, as I mentioned, Russians were very big on the theoretical aspects of flight, but they didn't have enough funding to build experimental versions, and so they had to import a lot of things, especially when it came to military terms. So most of the early Russian aircraft of the Imperial Russian Air Fleet were a foreign manufacturer. Sikorsky made a few, but this one was his main contribution to the Russian war effort.
In England, yeah. And the next question.
Yes, sir.
In the photos of Ilya Muromets, in all photos, there is here is the same support at the end. Here and here.
Yes.
It's absolutely logical because it makes the
Yes.
triangle, and
Yes.
this is not the stiff enough.
Correct.
Stiff if it is 45 degrees.
Correct.
All photos have this. Perhaps you can add this vertical support at the end of.
There is a reason for that, and I was wondering if anyone was going to notice. This kit came out in the 90s, and basically the manufacturing standards weren't the highest. So those struts that you're talking about, as I was putting them on, broke.
I don't understand it.
Broke.
Broke.
They broke. At the time, I didn't think I'd have enough time to basically make some new ones, fit them to size, and then add them. I mean, I could do that later now that this presentation is over with, but at the time I was just too pressed to find the right size piece of plastic, cut it exactly right, and make sure it fit. All right, so that's the story behind the missing struts. Anything else? Yes, Ronnie.
I'm really interested in the fuel. What kind, like, how did they source it? What kind of fuel were they using? I'm guessing as they're going from place to place, they'd have to have enough to make it back.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, that was one of the big considerations, the logistics of supplying the aircraft, because you not only needed fuel, but you needed spare parts, right? You needed hopefully a spare engine, because as I said, they were very unreliable in those days. So the logistics of doing that was considerable, and especially during the war, it became difficult as the Russians had to pull back. They were pulling back their bases. So this type of aircraft, any aircraft, needed a lot of maintenance, a lot of very careful care. When you're moving airfields constantly, that diminishes, all right? And it results in poor maintenance, all kinds of other problems. So they were also plagued by that, constantly moving back. And then as they advanced, there was the reverse problem. As they were moving forward, establishing the air bases, again, proved to be quite challenging. Especially, again, in these days when everything was basically new. The book was being written at the time. There was no precedent to fall back on. Right. Everything that was done, this was being done for the very first time. So it was all up to the ingenuity of the pilots, the ground crew, and the mechanics to make all this work.
Do you have any idea about the range of some of these, like the idiom movements?
That would basically depend on its mission, but it easily could do 400 to 600 miles. I'm not sure what that is in kilometers. But again, it depended on the mission. Also, later versions of the aircraft, now, how well you can see it, but right up here above the cockpit are two long tubular fuel tanks. All right? As things developed, they added additional fuel tanks underneath the wing right beside the engine. So they were able to greatly increase the range by simply increasing the amount of fuel they carried. So it, as I said, it varied depending on the mission and what they were planning on doing. Anybody else?
Сегодня я могу сказать, что у нас есть 3 человека, которые никогда до этого не были на «Друзьях музея». Это Анечка Гурлей, это Юрий Григорьев и Джордж Зупко. Поэтому мы повторим все, как у нас раньше было. Мы пододвинем сейчас стульчики. И вот этот стол надо будет поставить в центр с этой скатертью. И можно чай ставить так, что, пожалуйста, welcome to the next part. Пирожки.
Okay. Very good, very good.